Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. We're currently batch recording our upcoming episodes, so I've asked some friends to take care of the podcast in a limited author takeover series. You'll recognize them as former guests on the show, so you'll be in good hands. I look forward to chatting again soon.
Is there a correct way to write your story? If you look at the numerous books on writing that are available to the budding author, you would certainly get that impression. My own shelves are full of such books, telling me how to write my own hero's journey or how to form the perfect 3, 5 or even 7-act structure. I read them all, and yet my writing still wasn't going anywhere. That approach just didn't work for me, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. My name is Andrew Dart, and in this episode of the Speculative Sandbox Author Takeover series, I'm going to be talking about my journey from plotter to pantser and how writing your way is always the right way to write. Let me start by telling you a bit of my own history as a failed writer. I was a keen reader from an early age, but I didn't become interested in writing my own stories until I was 15. As part of my English coursework at school, I had to write a story that ended with the line, "And it just goes to show how danger can bring out the best and worst in people." This started a fire in my imagination, and, heavily inspired by the Clive Cussler novels I was reading at the time, I wrote my own mid-ocean adventure in which my hero, Marcus Flint, led a group of survivors to safety from the heart of a sinking ocean liner. Clearly, originality wasn't my strong point, but I did well on the assignment and, more importantly, I caught the writing bug. Over the next 25 years, I would continuously try, and continuously fail, to write a full-length novel of my own. With one exception, which I will come back to, I didn't complete any of the stories I started during that time. My computer hard drive is littered with half-written stories, tales that began with such promise but which ultimately died a premature death, often within a handful of chapters. I found this incredibly disheartening and contemplated giving up writing completely on numerous occasions. But I couldn't stop new ideas from popping into my head, and, after a suitable grieving period for my previous attempt, I would be back at it with a new idea within a couple of months. What was I doing wrong? As I said at the beginning, I own multiple books on writing. I have read through all of them. I have pages and pages of notes on how to plot out a story, how to build characters, and what elements you should include at different parts of your tale, and yet none of it was working for me. I would come up with a strong start. I would have a suitably epic finale in mind, and I would start writing. But all too soon I would find myself going off course, the story and the characters leading me places I hadn't planned for them to go, and I would get lost and ultimately grind to a halt. I would then spend months mentally trying to beat my story back onto the path I intended, before, finally, giving up when the stubborn thing refused to be moved. I needed a new approach. I needed to find a way to write that didn't lead to depression and self-recrimination. And then, in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, I found an answer, or more accurately, an answer found me. Several members of the writing group to which I belong were talking about taking part in that year's NaNoWriMo. For those of you who have not heard of NaNoWriMo, much like me at the time, it is short for National Novel Writing Month and challenges people to write a 50,000-word novel in just the 30 days of November. It is a daunting experience, not one for the faint-hearted, but at the time I had no idea what I would be getting myself into and thought it sounded fun. I only had one problem. It was 2 days until November and I had absolutely no idea what to write about. I didn't have time to start plotting things out, or to engage in some over-the-top world-building project. I needed an idea, and I needed it now. Brainstorming over lunch with a fellow creative writer from work, I came up with a single sentence that would form the basis of, and the entirety of the preparation I did, for the novel I would write. What if someone writes fortune cookies that always come true? The next day was the start of November, and I had 1,666 words to write if I wanted to stay on schedule. I sat down at my computer and started to write. So there's this guy, and he writes fortune cookies as a hobby, and, well, what? I had no idea what would happen next. I didn't even have a name for my character at that point. So instead, I just asked myself a simple question. What makes the most sense to happen next? Okay, so assuming my guy doesn't know he writes fortune cookies that come true, someone will need to tell him. And so there's a knock at the door. But who is it? Again, I ask myself what makes the most sense here. And so the person at the door is a detective, someone with the skills and access to have put together this idea that the fortune cookies were actually predicting the future. And so it went from there. Every time I would get to a point where I didn't know what was going to happen next, I would just ask myself that question. What makes sense? After a few chapters, I threw in a new question. How can I make things worse for my characters? And so I kept asking myself those two basic questions over and over until, at the end of November, I had written 54,000 words and had a practically complete story sitting in front of me. With everything that happened in the world after that, it would take me 2 years to finish, rewrite and edit the story, but in November 2021, I self-published my first novel. Unbeknownst to me, I had discovered a process known as pantsing, or discovery writing. This is a writing process in which the author doesn't really have any more idea of where the story is going when they are writing it than someone reading the finished story for the first time. And there are a lot of famous pantsers out there. Lee Child, author of the best-selling Jack Reacher series, is a major pantser. Even though his novels always seem incredibly well plotted, as anyone who has read one will agree, Child insists that when he starts out he only has the most basic idea of where things are heading, and he lets the story itself lead him the rest of the way. He strongly believes that the story that unfolds as he writes is the story that needs to be written. Val Collins, author of the award-winning psychological thriller Girl Targeted, is also a big fan of the discovery writing approach. As a reader, she wrote, she often can't turn the page fast enough, as she is desperate to find out what happens next. She continued that it is even more fun as a writer when a plot twist suddenly appears to you, and you have to keep writing to see where your own story is going. I had found a process that worked for me. In the year since finishing my first novel, I have written a second 150,000-word book using the discovery writing approach, and all going well, plan to have it completely finished within the next few months. Of course, I am sure you are all asking yourself the question, if I just write whatever comes to mind, how do I make it all fit together in the end? That is an excellent question. Well done you. And another famous pantser, Neil Gaiman, author of American Gods and Neverwhere, has an answer for you. His advice is simple. Write down everything that happens in the story, and then in your second draft, make it look like you knew what you were doing all along. This is exactly what I did with my own books. In my first book, Little Words of Wisdom, I had characters who appeared out of nowhere in the first draft, because I had no idea they were even a thing before they turned up. But when I went back to do a rewrite, I was able to drop in hints and comments about them beforehand, so that when they show up in the story, it seems more of an inevitability than a surprise. I hear you say, what about that one story you wrote in which you said you would come back to? Well, as it turns out, I actually discovered pantsing when I was 18 and then immediately forgot about it and went back to writing the way I thought I was meant to. At the time, a friend of mine challenged me to write a book they would enjoy. I knew he liked high adventure and fantasy stories, and with no more idea than that, I started writing. I had so little idea where things were going that I made myself the main character. It was the biggest Mary Sue to ever Mary Sue a Mary Sue. But by asking myself those questions, what makes sense and how can I make things worse for my characters, I managed to produce a 75,000-word book when I was still a teenager. If only I'd actually learnt from that experience. I'm saying you should all just throw away your carefully plotted story outlines, your character genealogies and your intricately designed world maps and just write whatever pops into your head? No, of course not. If that all works for you, then please keep doing it. What I'm saying is that if you find an approach that works for you, then that's what you should do, whatever it is. Here's another option for you. I'm currently working on a project using what I like to call the get other people to do the hard work for you approach. I have come up with a basic plot, I have a list of characters, and I have even engaged in a little bit of world building to flesh out my setting. And now I'm going to run the whole thing as a tabletop RPG. I've assigned the key characters to 3 of my friends, and I plan on letting them guide the story wherever it may go. They will be responsible for asking the what makes sense questions, while I focus on the how can I make things worse for them part. Will this approach produce something great? I have no idea, but it will be fun to try, and I will come away from it with more ideas if nothing else. Point is that whether you are a pantser like me, or a plotter, or something in between, the only wrong way to write is not to write at all. Don't be afraid to try something different, something that will have you adding words to your story. If your first draft is awful, don't worry about it. That's what second drafts are for, and at the very least you will know you can write a complete story. When I'm working on a novel, I like to set myself small weekly word goals and then see how long of a streak I can keep that going for. If I keep failing to meet my goals, then I adjust them until my confidence is back. Maybe that will work for you, or maybe you prefer to sit down for a few hours and focus on writing once a week. If that is your approach, then don't worry about whether you write one word or a few thousand. As long as you focus on something related to your writing during that time, it counts as a win. Writing is hard. It takes time and effort, and often a lot of stress as well. But writing should be fun. That's why many of us do it in the first place. If you're finding that your writing is a slog and you're not getting anywhere with it, then why not shake things up a bit? It's the start of a new year, so try something new. Try writing with no idea where you are going. Make a game out of how many weeks in a row you can reach your writing goal. Get your friends involved and make a joint project out of it. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? You end up writing as little as you already are? Sounds to me like you have nothing to lose by trying a new approach. But hey, don't let me tell you what to do. Find whatever works for you and do that. Write what you want, the way you want, and be sure to let me know when you are done so I can read what you came up with. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Speculative Sandbox Author Takeover series with me, Andrew Dart. If you'd like to see where my own pants and adventures have taken me, then check out my cosy mystery novel, Little Words of Wisdom. In an attempt to deal with the profound grief of losing his wife, Steve Lander throws himself into a new hobby of making fortune cookies. He's good at it, and it keeps his mind busy. But when a detective from the Metropolitan Police shows up at his door, everything changes, because it seems that the words Steve writes in his fortune cookies have a strange habit of coming true. Little Words of Wisdom is available as an ebook and in a paperback format from Amazon. You can find out more about me at andrewdart.co.uk, including details of my new novel, The Blight, an urban fantasy fairy tale adventure about cats, due out in the next few months. That's andrewdart.co.uk. Also check out my previous episode with Vicky on Speculative Sandbox, in which we discuss the topic of modern gods. Thank you for listening, and here's wishing you all the very best with your writing projects in 2023, however you go about.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.